So, hello, Emily. Thank you for joining us. Can you tell us first a bit about your background and a little bit about why you've written your book, Genius Gut?
Absolutely. I mean, I've got a copy here.
Nice, lovely.
So I'm Dr. Emily Leeming. I'm a microbiome scientist. I do research at King's College London, and I'm also a registered dietitian and former chef. My first job was as a chef on super yachts. So I've really spanned through from food, working one-on-one with clients, to now spending a lot of time looking at the data and the latest evidence. So I've written this book that's called Genius Gut, and it's the life-changing science of eating for your second brain. And effectively, it's a easy guide breaking down the science of the gut-brain connection, everything that you need to know about gut health and how the gut signals to the brain, and then also 10 simple hacks on what to eat and how to eat to boost your mood, be mentally sharp, and to feel amazing. So it's very much lots of actionable tips and advice that are also delicious, because that's also important too.
Definitely. So, in what ways is our gut like our brain?
So our gut is called our second brain for a number of reasons, but for the most part, it's because it has its own nervous system called the enteric nervous system. Now, this is a web of nerves that goes from your esophagus in your throat all the way down to your bum, because actually your gut isn't just your intestines or your belly. It's actually starting at your mouth and going all the way down to your bum. So this web of nerves, this enteric nervous system, has very fine-tuned, complex control over every single part of your digestive system. It needs to be able to really have fine-tuned control over when digestive juices get released, when food needs to be moving through, so it's moving muscles, but it's also sensing nutrients and sending that back to the brain as well. So it actually functions a lot more independently than any other organ from the brain, although still referring back to the essential authority of the brain being the CEO of the body. So it can't write equations or dream like our brain can, but it's in itself been really underestimated for how complex it is. It also is able to produce serotonin and dopamine like the brain is able to. And it also has a direct pathway back to the brain through a nerve called the vagus nerve. And this is effectively a two-way communication highway, of which 90% of the chat going up and down this highway is from the gut going up to the brain.
Nice. And you hear a lot about the vagus nerve in terms of stress and general mental health. And I mean, is that why things like stress and mental health in the gut have such a strong connection?
Yeah, so I think we've almost had this in our language itself for a really long time. We've kind of understood subconsciously that there's this really powerful connection between the gut and the brain, and the most direct pathway is the vagus nerve, to being able to connect the gut and the brain. But it's really the science of when we talk about gut feelings or gut instincts, or having kind of butterflies in our stomach. So that's something that we're really sensing emotionally, but also kind of within our gut. But then it's also that, we all know somebody, or maybe that person is whoever's listening now, who's been very stressed and then had to rush the bathroom because that stress is then communicated down to the gut and made them need to kind of urgently go to the loo. So it's very much this two-way street. And I think we're now fully understanding a lot more that it's not just the brain down, it's also the gut up.
Nice. And are there any mental health conditions or other conditions that are more strongly related to our gut health?
Yeah, so there's really interesting evidence around. So we see, for example, for mental health conditions, so depression and anxiety, that people with depression and anxiety tend to have a very different microbiome makeup, so a different makeup of different types of gut bacteria than people who don't have depression or anxiety. If we just talk about depression for a moment, we also see that they have lower levels in something called short-chain fatty acids. Now, these are very special molecules that are produced by your gut bacteria when they feed on fiber, fiber being the roughage from plant foods like fruits, vegetables, beans, legumes, and nuts and seeds. And we can't make these short chain fatty acids ourselves. we have to have our gut bacteria to be able to make them. So we see in depression that they have lower levels of these short chain fatty acids. And we also see that if we transplant the microbiome from somebody with depression into a rat, the researchers were able to what they call transfer the blues. So they're able to kind of see these depressive symptoms shifting over from the donor into the recipient rat, really showing that it's not just a kind of knock-on effect, having this change in the microbiome, but there's also this kind of one part, the piece of the puzzle towards potentially causing this as a condition. And we see also this in very similar patterns with also neurodegenerative conditions like Alzheimer's and Parkinson's disease. Really interesting kind of early signs that perhaps is actually starting in the gut way before you see symptoms later on in the brain. Parkinson's is a really interesting example of this, where up to 80% of people who have Parkinson's disease also have constipation. And in fact, that constipation can be up to 20 years before they actually see any other symptoms of Parkinson's disease. So really exciting, expanding research in this area.
Yeah, that is really interesting. And with that discovery and being able to catch it sooner potentially, I mean, can symptoms be prevented through a change in diet and a healthier gut, or do we not know?
Yeah, so we know that, for example, that eating a healthy diet is seen to help to lower risk of getting neurodegenerative diseases like Alzheimer's disease and Parkinson's, but also associated with a lower risk of depression, anxiety. So we already have these kind of big population studies looking at this. And I think it's also really recognizing that the brain health has really kind of been forgotten about until there's a problem. And a lot of the time especially with neurodegenerative conditions, it's really thinking about it right now and about how we need to be protecting our brain rather than necessarily just waiting until there's a problem arising, because sometimes that can be something where it's a little bit too late to make a significant impact. It's very much not to say that there isn't a possibility, but just that we really need to be thinking about this a lot earlier and talking about brain health. So that's something. And I think especially with depression as well, in 2017, the research in Australia ran the first randomized control trial looking at treating depression with Mediterranean dietary pattern. And what they found was that 30% of those with depression who were on the Mediterranean dietary pattern, they were still taking their medication, they were still on therapy. So this is very much talking about it as an additional tool in the toolkit. They found that 30% of the people went into remission for their depressive symptoms. They weren't classified as being clinically depressed anymore. So I mean, this really signals that, it's an extra tool that can be used to help us to feel better in our everyday, but also for people with mental health conditions, very much personalized and dependent on their treatment plan. But it can be an extra tool in the toolkit.
Fascinating. And what role does our gut microbiome play in our early development, in our childhood development?
Yeah, so when you're a baby and you're being coming out of your mother, that is when you first get your first seeding of microbes. So we talk about microbes as these microorganisms that are mostly kind of bacteria, viruses, fungi, and archaea. We mostly talk about bacteria because they happen to be the ones that we know the most about. So you get your first seeding, your first dose of microbes from your mother, from her vaginal microbiome, but also from her gut microbiome, because you're within the area of where poo and everything comes out. So therefore, that's a really great starting point for you as a baby and your gut. If you're born by cesarean C-section, your first microbes are introduced from the environment, from the hospital environment, and also from the skin microbiome of doctors and the nurses, and also your parents. So you start life with quite a different gut microbiome. What was really interesting, so a study that looked at babies who were 3 to 6 months old, they found that those who had been given a swab of a mother's vaginal microbiome, there were C-section babies given a swab of the vaginal microbiome and put into their guts, versus the babies who had just been born by C-section, those who were born by C-section with the vaginal swab had much better brain development, significantly better brain development and function than the babies who were born by C-section alone. So I think really highlighting there's kind of an early connection there. Likewise, our brain continues to develop up until about 25 years old. And we see associations with different types of gut bacteria. So for example, between 2 and 3 years old being differences in their gut bacteria being associated with how well children are able to kind of recognize each other, how well they're able to draw, their kind of spatial movements. And also another study looking at children from 2 until the age of 10 years old, showing that the gut microbiome was also linked to differences in the sizes of different parts of the brain as well. And this relationship continues, even past brain development. So we see, a small study looking at 26-year-olds, so young, healthy adults, that their microbiome was also linked to how well they were able to perform on mental tasks as well.
Interesting.
And we see, I think one of the things to really add there is this is really exciting early research and science, and a lot of the understanding of how this is happening is from my studies. So that, we also necessarily have to make sure we're taking that with a pinch of salt, because my studies don't always translate to human studies, but they're usually a really useful tool, an early part of this research pipeline that we can then take and look at later on. And I think a really interesting example with mice and brain development from birth, mice that were born without a gut microbiome. So they effectively were born into what's called a germ-free facility from mothers who've had their microbiome completely knocked out, which, obviously you wouldn't be able to do this in humans. It wouldn't be ethical. We wouldn't want to do that. But in mice, they were able to show that the mice that were born into this completely sterile facility, they didn't have a gut microbiome, their brains didn't develop properly, and particularly their hippocampus, which is to do with memory and learning. And their guts were very kind of misformed and misshaped, and a very significant, one of the biggest changes that was really noticed by the researchers were they had very altered social behavior as well.
Yeah, it's so interesting. And on the social side, I mean, what is there something to be said about, face-to-face relationships and understanding that through gut health? Because you mentioned it there with being able to recognize people easier in childhood and things like what's going on. It almost gets a bit spooky.
Yeah,
When you imagine the kind of hybrid nature of our existence with.
It does. It seems, I think when we talk about this, it seems almost a bit fantastical. And what I kind of say is we've got to look back to the very beginning to really understand what our relationship with microbes is all about. And really, before humans even existed, this planet was dominated by microbes. They are all around us. They're covered every single surface. So there's not one part of our evolution experience or any part of our development where we haven't been with microbes step by step throughout the entire process. And I think something I like to share in the book, I like to use lots of kind of fun analogies, because I very much feel that science should be easy and relatable. Is talking about how if aliens were to come down from space, they would classify us humans as hybrid species, because we have as many microbial cells as we have human cells. So really they're all around us. They're not just in our gut. There's 100 trillion of them living in our gut microbiome, in our lower and large intestine, but we're also covered in them all around, and they're all around us. We're breathing in them. Even just 1 teaspoon of soil contains more microbes than there are humans on this planet. So yeah, we've might not be able to see them with the naked eye, but they're very much a very key part of every single part of us.
And how does that work in relationships when we are face to face with others? Is there some interaction that happens?
So there's one part where so the first part is kind of talking about actually the fact that we exchange microbes between us. So even if you kiss someone, for example, for 10 seconds, so researchers have actually looked at this, they've done a research paper on this. And they see that if you kiss someone for 10 seconds, you can exchange 8 million microbes from one mouth to another. So that's, the beginning of your digestive system, which then can potentially pass through into your gut. So there's very much this transmission of microbes, and we see this in babies and children as well, that by the time they're 5 years old, they have as many microbes from their father as they do from their mother, because there's that kind of equal kind of interaction going on. The other thing when we think about recognizing faces and being able to interact as human beings, there's a thought that perhaps our sociability is also influenced by our gut bacteria. Could it be that they are wanting to then get this transfer of microbes because it's beneficial to them? So they're thought to be able to potentially influence our levels of oxytocin, being the kind of cuddle sociability hormone, and therefore could explain why some of us want to be kind of more social than others. And they've actually even looked at another study looking at personality traits, and seeing that certain personality traits was also linked to the makeup of their gut microbiome too. So there's kind of interesting evidence around that. And I think also looking at studies that look at prebiotics. So these are certain substances that feed your gut bacteria to have a health effect, and also certain foods. For example, kefir, really interesting research around kefir, small study where they gave them 2 glasses of kefir a day, and they looked at their brain scans. And what they showed was that when they were taking the kefir rather than the placebo, was that they had less emotional response to negative images. And they think that's also because the microbiome and the gut bacteria can potentially influence the release of GABA, which is your kind of calm hormone. And therefore, you're then having less of an emotional reaction and being kind of more emotionally resilient as well.
Okay, interesting. Wow. And what are the kind of some of the main signs that someone might want to take a look at their gut health? What are the danger signs?
So I think really the big ones are really looking actually into the loo, looking at the poo. You want to look at the shape, you want to look at the color of it, and you want to know how often you're going. So this is really the key, very kind of stark, obvious ones. So you want to have a brown poo. If it is red, then you probably need to go to the doctor, because that can be a red flag symptom. And could be a sign of something more sinister going on, for example, like colorectal cancer. So it's always worth getting that checked out. You want to be going between 3 times a day to 3 times a week. So you can see there's quite a bit of variation there. So really it's whatever is kind of normal for you within that bracket. And then you also want it to be a kind of a smooth sausage, or a smooth sausage with cracks in it. And that's something that can really help to show that what the health of your gut is, which is the home of your gut microbiome, but also a significant portion of your poo is also made up of gut microbes. So you want to also be making sure that you're not having any kind of digestive kind of stomach issues that are going with that. It's totally normal to have a bit of bloating after a meal. In fact, I would actually say that's a sign of a healthy gut microbiome, to have a little bit of bloating in the hour after a meal, because what happens when your gut bacteria feed on that plant roughage, that fiber, and they make those special molecules, those short chain fatty acids for our health, they also produce gas as a side effect. So having a little bit of gas is kind of a sign that perhaps you actually have you've thrown them a little bit of a party and they're happy about it. But if you've got uncomfortable bloating for a significant, portion of the day or throughout the day, and that feels really, uncomfortable, that could also be a sign that something going on. And then also talking about this gut-brain connection. Again, this could be something that could be applied to many different things, but just feeling very tired, lots of, different kind of feeling irritable. There's lots of different signals that could be happening. Yes, you probably want to rule out that they're not something else, but it could be a sign that it's worth looking at your gut health.
Thank you. And why is it that fiber is so important, and how can we get more of it?
So I wax lyrical about fiber. I feel like fiber has been just dismissed and kind of not thought of as it's kind of been the forgotten nutrient. And really, to me, it's a little bit like Clark Kent, where everybody's just thought, so it's a bit kind of boring and kind of inconsequential, when actually it's the closest thing we have to superfood. So every 5 grams of fiber that we have, that is linked to a 5% lower risk of depression, but also it's, you know, body wide, many different benefits as well. So just for context, 5 grams of fiber is about a third of a can of chickpeas. If you were up that to have half a can of chickpeas, equivalent to 7 grams of fiber, so it's really about the 7 grams of fiber here, that's related to a 9% lower risk of heart disease, a 6% lower risk of type 2 diabetes, and an 8% lower risk of colorectal cancer. So there's many different health benefits, but there's also health benefits in the here and now. I really like to talk about health. It's not just kind of trying to ward off something that might potentially happen later in life, but also talking about your energy levels, talking about your mood, talking about your cognition. And we know that fiber helps you to stay full and feel full for longer. It adds volume and bulk to your food, and then you get through your stretch receptors in your gut, that muscle stretching, that sends signals back to your brain that you feel full. It also helps to slow the release of sugar into your bloodstream, which gives you more consistent energy for longer. It's also involved in your cholesterol and your blood pressure. And when it comes to your mood and cognition, we see that actually there's certain types of fiber that your gut bacteria particularly like, and researchers have looked and found that actually these certain types have been able to kind of help to improve memory, not just in the long term, but also in a very kind of short period of time, within kind of 48 hours. And in fact, actually, colleagues of mine at King's College London did a study on older adults who were kind of 60 years and above, and found that giving them a certain type of this fiber, this probiotic fiber, that over a 3-month period, they, in comparison to the placebo, they had much better scores on their memory tests at the end of that 3-month period, just from this tiny kind of fiber supplement.
Interesting. Interesting. And do you have a take on weight loss drugs like Ozempic, just in terms of either the impact of the drug themselves on gut health, or the fact that they are, you know, an appetite suppressant, or they play with the kind of satiety hormones in your brain? Do you have any opinions?
Yeah, so 40% of kind of all medications that we know of at the moment, they impact the gut microbiome, and that might be a positive impact or it might be a negative impact. What it seems to be with these kind of weight loss drugs at the moment, and I'm talking about, when you say what the actual brand is, Ozempic, and kind of the components in that, is that seems to actually potentially have a slightly kind of positive effect on the gut microbiome. But that could be because actually, is that drug helping someone to switch from a less healthy diet to a diet that is containing more of these fruits and vegetables, more of these beans and legumes, more whole grains, and more foods that your gut bacteria really like to have. So although it's reducing appetite and therefore you're potentially having less food intake, it might actually be a tool to therefore help you to make choices that actually feed your gut bacteria and help to improve your gut health. So I think it's going to be really interesting to see what happens in the next couple of years and really understand that connection and that relationship more. But I think at the end of the day, it really kind of comes down to what are the foods that you're having in the long term, because it's really that long-term picture that matters the most for your gut microbiome.
That makes sense. Thank you. And what is the impact of modern life on the diversity of our gut microbiome, and what are the consequences of that?
Yeah, so I think we think that that we've lost quite a significant amount of different types of gut bacteria. So a healthy gut microbiome is really one that contains lots of different types of gut bacteria. It's kind of like having a company where you don't just want to have a marketing department, because you're not going to get very far. You want to have lots of different people who have lots of different skill sets. And it's the same with our gut bacteria as well. We want lots of different types of gut bacteria because they all produce slightly different molecules and do have different actions. So we think that actually in modern life, the way that we're living is actually having a quite significant detrimental effect on our gut bacteria, and that we're losing kind of significant amount of these different types of gut bacteria. This is because we're having quite an excessive amount of antibiotics. Yes, they are life-saving medication. I definitely say if someone is prescribed antibiotics, please do take them, because that is really important for your health. But actually, we are taking antibiotics when in cases when we don't necessarily need to be taking them. For example, I know people going to their GP and asking for antibiotics for the common cough, which is a viral infection of which antibiotics don't do anything for. And actually, we know that these antibiotics are not just targeting the bad bacteria that we want to get rid of that are causing problems. They are also impacting the rest of the environment in the gut microbiome too. And those changes can last for up to 6 months before your gut microbiome is able to repopulate. The other issues that we have with modern life is that we spend far too much time sitting and not doing enough exercise. Exercise really helps with the health of our gut, the home of our gut microbiome. It helps to bring in new fresh blood supply and nutrients, and also that action of moving your body helps to your digestion and to keep food moving through as well. And then also we're living in this environment that is very sterile. We are not spending enough time in nature where, you know, we're being able to interact with animals and interact and having time with soil, which is very microbe rich, and also things like air pollution as well. And I think just for comparison, we look at a tribe in Tanzania called the Hadza tribe, which is our kind of closest benchmark for how we would live in a very kind of ancestral way, how we would live before we had this modern lifestyle. And this Hadza tribe is one of the kind of last hunter-gatherer tribes in Africa, where they effectively hunt, they forage, they're doing a lot of movement, they're spending most of their time outside, they are having a very fiber-dense, fiber-rich diet, and in comparison to them, we've lost 124 species of gut bacteria in the Western world.
Interesting, really interesting. And so what are kind of a few staples that you'd recommend anyone has in their kitchen cupboards to help them with their gut health?
So I like to keep it really easy and practical, because I think many of us, we've all got way too many things going on and on our plates. And I think, you know, it's actually what are the things that we can regularly have on our shopping list that are going to make it easy to get more fiber into our diet. So we're meant to be having 30 grams of fiber a day, but also those other foods that are really helpful for our gut bacteria, like fermented foods. So I talk about what I call the BGBGs as being the kind of really nice kind of high fiber heavyweights. So these are beans, greens, berries, grains, and nuts and seeds. And particularly, I think really focusing on the fact that whole grains and nuts and seeds and beans are particularly high in fiber. So just for context, lettuce, you know, which we all kind of, I think, associate with fiber and that kind of plant roughage. Yes, really great for our health, but actually it contains about 1.8 grams of fiber per 100 grams. Not, you know, nothing wrong with that. It's still kind of a contributing factor. But in comparison to that, beans and legumes have 4 to 5 times more fiber than lettuce. So you just have to eat a smaller volume, and you're getting kind of more in, as again, we're talking about that kind of a third of a can earlier, or half a can. Talking about bread and making swaps to your bread. So you're thinking about the whole grains there. So swapping your bread to, say, a pumpernickel bread. A pumpernickel rye bread, just one slice is 6 grams of fiber. And then thinking about nuts and seeds, a really great way to, so I keep a jar next to the kettle for a snack. I have them so I can, a mixture so I can sprinkle onto my breakfast in the morning, or kind of add on top to salads or veggie dishes. And if you have, for example, chia seeds, a tablespoon and a half or 2 tablespoons of flax seeds, that's equivalent to 6 grams of fiber. So these are all really small, simple changes that you can make that will increase your fiber intake in a very simple way without having to be overcomplicated. I've got this big kind of thing against, you know, I feel that we've overcomplicated gut health, and actually it's not. And it's just a lot of companies trying to make, you know, make some money.
Absolutely. And can you share just 1 or 2 of your health hacks from the book? Obviously not all of them.
Yes. So, okay. So I have 10 simple hacks in this book. And they're very much based off my experience and background as a chef, as a dietitian, and as a scientist. So for me, the key factors is it's got to be simple, it's got to be practical, it's got to be easy to implement, and it's got to be delicious, because life is too short to have things that we don't enjoy. So the first one that I think it seems incredibly simple, and I think everybody can do, is just make half your plate fruits or vegetables. So that's breakfast in the morning, you know, making berries half of your bowl, with whatever you're having, whether it's kind of kefir and yogurt and nuts and seeds on top, or then lunch and dinner as well. So that's going to help get lots of beneficial nutrients and compounds and all that fiber in for your gut bacteria as well. The BGBGs is kind of a second one. I'm also a really big fan. In the book, I'd have a whole chapter on this, on breakfast. I think breakfast has had way too much unfair airtime of, oh, should we skip it? Should we not? When actually we see in multiple countries that people who skip breakfast tend to eat less fiber, they have less healthy diets, they're kind of lacking on more on key nutrients, and they also tend to have a lower mood, particularly after breakfast, and they also end up having more food cravings. So actually really kind of focusing on what I call kind of a protein fiber rich breakfast is a really great way to start the day for your brain and also for your gut bacteria as well.
Thank you so much, Emily. It's been great to talk to you. It's really fascinating, and the book's great.
Thank you. Thanks so much for having me.